Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Reason Versus. Before we get to the main event, please welcome to the stage Andrew Heaton.
Hey, room. Hello. You excited to talk about drugs here in a minute? Good. Okay, so for my benefit, before we get started, by show of hands, who here has done an illegal narcotic? All right. You morons. You fools. I'm dressed like a 1970s narc, and you copped up to that immediately. You're all going to get fired by Doge. What are you doing with your lives? So do you think alcohol counts as a drug? What do you reckon? Yeah? Everybody's nodding. I'm in agreement with you. I think alcohol counts as a drug. When I was 21, I learned don't mix beer with wine because you get a hangover. And I'm now 41, and I recently learned you shouldn't mix scotch with back pain medication because you black out. That's what you do. You just black out when you mix scotch and back pain medication together. So I kind of want to give parameters for everybody here if you're not familiar with what's going on. So I'm guessing most of you are excited, you know what's going on, but if you got brought by a friend or your spouse dragged you or it's a really interesting hostage scenario, we're about to have a debate about legalizing drugs. You're going to have Reason, which is a libertarian outfit, on one side, and you're going to have, yay, Reason! Yes! And you're going to have City Journal? Yes! Oh, wait, hold on. We got to make a decision, gang. We got to make a decision. Are we going to be supportive or are we going lucha libre? I'm okay with lucha libre. All right, make your decision. And also City Journal. Okay, we went supportive. I like that. Which is like moderate urban conservative. I'm sure there's some hyphens in there. There's something going on there. So they're going to be debating it. If you're unfamiliar with kind of where everybody is right now, we're in a really weird place historically. The conservative movement has been fractured. So there's kind of two camps right now in the conservative movement. There's people who use all caps on Twitter. And there's people who think this time will be different when we invade Iran. This time will be different. We will be welcomed as liberators. They had miniskirts in the 70s, you guys. So that's the conservative side of it. The libertarian side of it, way more divisive. I probably shouldn't even air this dirty laundry, but I'm going to do it real quick. I don't know if you guys were paying attention to the last election. The libertarians, there are two camps right now. So on one side of the libertarian divide are former magicians. And then the other side is just autism. It's just autism over there. Like you could replace the porcupine with a guy in a top hat going, actually, and it would pretty much work. I'm an independent, by the way. I'm an independent. I'm not a member of any political party. I am ethnically Republican. Like I speak their language. I've dated their women. But I'm a little too fun to be Republican and I'm a little too thin to vote for one. So I'm not doing that. I was a Democrat for a while. But, okay, Republicans don't really like drugs. Democrats don't like that other thing. What do you call that? Success. They're opposed to that. They hate that thing. They're like, how much money that guy make? $1 million? Fuck that guy. Providing goods and services. He should be taxed and then taxed again when he dies. We'll do that. I lost my virginity to a socialist. For real. Or if she's right, to all of you. Collectively. Thank you. Last Tuesday was amazing. It was a hell of a thing. I think it's very difficult to be a libertarian. Has anybody ever tried to play Sim City as a libertarian? Very boring. All right, I'm going to start the game, and I'm done. We're going to let the market handle Hayekberg. We'll do that. I'm going to reveal something to you. Whether you're conservative or you're libertarian, I don't think you're going to like what I'm about to say. But our relationship is based on trust. So I think it's important that I come clean on this. I like politicians. I know. Fair enough, but let me walk you through this. I like politicians. I like the energy and the vigor that they bring to convincing you They're not really politicians. I think that's charming. No other job in America works that way, where to get the job, you have to convince everybody you don't want the job. Like if I spent all day telling you, I hate basketball. Oh man, I hope I never play basketball. You would never make me go play basketball. But that's what you got to do as a politician. Like if somebody came to my door and went ding dong, and I went, oh, the electrician is here to fix the faulty socket in the baby's room. If the guy went, hold on now, I'm not a career electrician. I'm just a regular Joe who likes football and fishing and organized religion. I'd be like, get the hell out. You fool, get out of my house. Okay, they're going to debate drugs in a minute, but I'm a uniter, not a divider. And so I think that there's other places of overlap that we could find policy-wise, even if we disagree on drugs. Can I give you a couple of my policy recommendations before we go forward? Okay, and then I'll okay. So here's number one. Immigration's a big flashpoint, right? You heard about this? The immigration? They're fighting about this. Here's my plan. Anybody can come to America. Thank you. Let me finish. I appreciate your enthusiasm. Anybody can come to America if they open up a cool ethnic restaurant. I think that would work pretty well. Like I lived in Texas for a while. Nobody ever went, oh, another family-owned Mexican restaurant in our neighborhood. Now, you might try to get ahead of me and be like, well, what if a baddie slips in? Like, what if they open up an ethnic restaurant, but they're dangerous? And my response to that is, how good is their ethnic food? Like, do you guys know what kunefe is? You guys ever had kunefe? Anybody know that? It's like a Turkish food. If you don't know it, just later tonight, go get Turkish food. Kunefe is, it's like baklava with honey and molten cheese. It's so delicious. I would not only risk the lives of my fellow citizens to have unfettered access to kunefe, I would kill all of you. That's how good kunefe is. The other one I'm coming up with is occupational licensing. Here's my thought on occupational licensing. You only have to get a license for jobs where if you screw up, unwanted body fluids come out of you. That's it. It's like if you get electrocuted or like blood shoots out your neck. But that's it. No other job. Like, okay, for example, morticians. If you screw up as a mortician, like worst case scenario, the corpse comes back to life. A really bad mortician is a pretty good doctor. Or like, okay, in Florida, anybody from Florida? Yeah, shout out to Florida. It's a great state. In Florida, they have licenses for psychics. Let that sink in for a minute. The Florida state government is protecting its citizens from fake psychics who would take advantage of people by claiming to have the ability to see the future. So they've put in a helpful licensing regime to stop that from happening. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to leave here in a second because I took a couple of Quaaludes before I got started, and that's about to kick in. It's starting to get kind of groovy. Before I go, I want to give you a gift. May I give you a gift before I take off? Great. So I'm going to give you a gift. Take out your phones. I'm going to give you a website address. mightyheaton.com/hotdogs. So I'm Andrew Heaton, Heaton, mightyheaton.com/hotdogs, which would be like the plural of hot dog, mightyheaton.com/hotdogs. If you go there, I will share with you my personal collection of photographs of politicians deep-throating hot dogs. Okay, apparently people have started to find it. Good, it's coming through there okay? Whenever you start feeling worried about the future of our country, or you're worried about politicians, just go to that website, see those presidential hopefuls deep-throating hot dogs, and feel a little bit better about the world. And I will add, if you click on any of those pictures of politicians eating hot dogs, it will take you to my podcast, The Political Orphanage, and you can stay with me there. So enjoy the debate, and thank you so much. Bye.
Andrew Heaton, everyone. And now for the main event of the evening. Please welcome to the stage from City Journal, Charles Fain Lehman and Rafael Mangual. And from Reason Magazine, it's Jacob Sullum and Billy Binion. And your host for the evening, Peter Suderman.
Hello and welcome to Reason Versus. It is so nice to see all of you here tonight. This is the debate series that pits Reason Magazine against other publications in a battle of big ideas. For this installment, Reason is taking on City Journal, a publication of the Manhattan Institute. I'm Peter Suderman. I'll be your moderator. Full disclosure, I do work at Reason, but my job tonight will be to try to be fair and at least mostly sober-minded, which I think will probably be appropriate for this debate because this evening our two sides will be arguing over the proposition, legalize all drugs. Now, because this is a debate, there will be a winner, and that winner will be decided by you, the audience. The way this is going to work is that there will be two votes. You're going to vote right now, that is, if you haven't already, and then you're going to vote again after the debate. And the team that has shifted the most support to their side will win. So if you have not cast your vote, please follow the instructions that are on the screen right now. And as you vote, I want you to think just a little bit about the resolution before us tonight. What exactly would it mean to legalize all drugs? It's a simple statement, just 3 words: legalize all drugs. But think a little bit more about those 3 words, and the complications and the questions begin to arise. What exactly is a drug? Most people here would probably say that marijuana counts, and so does fentanyl. But what about performance-enhancing substances like steroids? What about birth control or Plan B? What about Sudafed or caffeine? Or what about something like whippets? If you don't know what whippets are, they're the nitrous oxide fumes at the tail end of a whipped cream canister that the bartenders at the place that I worked many, many years ago used to like to experiment with. They make your voice high and they make you feel funny, and they are still technically illegal for recreational purposes. So the word drugs covers far more substances than you might initially think. And that leads us to another question. What practically would it mean to legalize all drugs? Would it just mean the end of police action, what we think of as the drug war? Would it mean abolishing the FDA? And finally, what does legalization mean? Socially, economically, and practically. After all, Sudafed is legal, but it's kept behind counters. Marijuana is quite legal in some places, definitely illegal in other places, and in some sort of murky middle ground in other places, all while still being restricted federally. And even fentanyl, the villain of so many of today's political narratives, is approved for medical use. I may not be the only person in this room who has had fentanyl injected into them legally by a doctor in a medical setting. So legalization might mean many things. For example, it might just mean no jail time for drug offenses. Or it might mean that big beer conglomerates become big pot conglomerates. What I'm saying is the very terms here are up for debate. And so are the social and legal and political consequences. Now, I have not conferred with either side about their arguments in advance, but any debate about drug legalization inevitably pits concerns about abuse and addiction and broader social harms against personal freedom, bodily autonomy, and the individual and collective costs of incarceration. This is a policy debate with ramifications for police procedure and bureaucratic rulemaking. But for so many people on both sides of this argument publicly, it is also a deeply, deeply personal issue that has touched their own lives and the lives of their family members. To discuss all of these issues and the questions that arise from them, we have 4 top-notch debaters here tonight. From City Journal, arguing against the resolution, we have Charles Fain Lehman and Rafael Mangual. And from Reason, arguing for the resolution, we have Billy Binion and Jacob Sullum. All four of our debaters have written and debated extensively about drug policy and criminal justice in the past. Folks, this is going to be a great debate. It is now time to close our initial vote and have that debate. So if you haven't voted, your time is up. It's over. We will start with opening statements, alternating between Reason and City Journal. Reason, let's start with you. I believe, Jacob Sullum, you are starting out. You have 4 minutes.
Humans like to get high. Their inclination to seek altered states of consciousness, frequently with the aid of chemical agents, is apparent throughout recorded history and across many cultures. That urge, like the sex drive and the desire for food, can cause problems. The question is how the government should respond to those problems. In particular, whether the use of force is justified to prevent people from consuming politically disfavored intoxicants. That sort of intervention contradicts the classical liberal principle that people are sovereign over their own bodies and minds. That's a tradition that frowns upon paternalistic policies that aim to protect people from the consequences of their own bad choices. Even if you don't fully embrace that view, you should be troubled by the practical consequences of drug prohibition, which include violence, rampant official corruption, squandered taxpayer money, diverted law enforcement resources, theft driven by artificially high drug prices, the potentially deadly hazards of consuming iffy black market drugs, long prison terms for conduct that is not inherently criminal, and the erosion of civil liberties. Now, you can avoid some of those costs by avoiding illegal drugs, but not all of them. If you value the right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures, for instance, you should be alarmed by the long line of Supreme Court cases that have whittled away at the Fourth Amendment to facilitate the war on drugs, which is also the main factor driving the system of legalized larceny known as civil asset forfeiture. The powers blessed by the Supreme Court build on the basic authority granted by prohibition, which legalizes police conduct that otherwise would be readily recognized as criminal. The casualties include people erroneously implicated in drug trafficking, such as Breonna Taylor, innocent bystanders, such as the toddler who was maimed by a flashbang grenade during a drug raid in Georgia, and people guilty of nothing more than engaging in consensual exchanges who are periodically killed by police during drug raids. Prohibition also fosters violence by creating a black market where there is no peaceful way to resolve disputes. Although the resulting bloodshed is often described as drug-related, that is true only in the sense that the St. Valentine's Day massacre was alcohol-related. Also, like alcohol prohibition, the war on drugs has resulted in widespread official corruption. Such corruption is especially striking in source countries, but it's also apparent across the United States, ranging from federal drug and border agents to prison guards and local police officers. The inflated profits that motivate and subsidize bribery also explain why politicians have never delivered on their promise to stop the flow of illegal drugs, despite more than a century of determined effort. That risk premium gives drug traffickers a powerful incentive to find ways around any barriers the government manages to erect. Instead of reducing drug-related harm, these efforts have magnified it in several ways. By artificially raising prices, prohibition encourages drug injection, which is the most cost-effective method of consumption, but also poses special dangers. Prohibition drives traffickers toward more potent substances because they're easier to smuggle. That phenomenon is reflected in the proliferation of illicit fentanyl and the earlier shift from opium to heroin. Ramped up enforcement of prohibition can always make the situation worse. Consider what happened after the crackdown on pain medication, which drove non-medical users toward black market substitutes that were much more dangerous. Even as opioid prescriptions fell dramatically, the upward trend in opioid-related deaths not only continued, but accelerated. Prohibition makes life worse, sometimes a lot worse, for people who defy it. Those costs supposedly are justified by benefits to other people, the ones who would have suffered drug-related harm because of bad choices deterred by prohibition. That trade-off is morally dubious, even if you accept paternalism as a justification for government intervention.
All right, City Journal, choose your fighter. Charles Fain Lehman.
That's me. Yeah, thank you, folks, the kind folks at Reason, for having us. Thanks to the Howard Theater. I'm pleased to see that there are addictive, harmful substances available in the back. You should avail yourselves of them. I'll be more persuasive. Myself and my colleague Rafael have two jobs tonight. One is to persuade you that drugs are bad, and the other one is to persuade you that prohibition works. The first one is easier, so I'm leaving it to him. Although I think that our opponents are probably willing to concede the basic idea that drugs are harmful. So it falls to me to argue that drug prohibition works and that the arguments against it don't make a lot of sense. To set that stage, I want to imagine the world without prohibition, just for a second. It's a world in which I can walk to my local Walmart and buy fentanyl. Amazon will deliver meth to my door by drone. This sounds very appealing to some of you in the audience, but to others not so much. Major firms get to innovate in drug design, because recall that all modern destructive, deadly drugs were first invented by pharmaceutical corporations. They also get to advertise, hand out free samples. In general, the efficiency of modern capitalistic free enterprise gets applied to the problem of getting people addicted to drugs. Why don't we live in that world? Well, the answer is prohibition. Prohibition is an application of the basic libertarian insight that government intervention makes markets less efficient. They work less well. Minimum wage laws make labor markets not clear. Environmental regulations make producers less efficient. And prohibition makes drug markets run worse. It makes it harder to run a business because drug sellers lose access to robust capital markets, to third-party businesses, to otherwise talented employees, and to innovation generally. For example, as I think Peter alluded to, many people in this room have probably taken fentanyl in a medical setting. Certainly if you've had an epidural, you have. And yet, it took 50 years between the time when fentanyl was first synthesized and it spread into the illicit market. Why? Prohibition. The pharmaceutical equivalents of drugs like meth and cocaine, which can be obtained in hospitals or by prescription, are far purer than the product on the street. Why? Prohibition. Heroin is extraordinarily expensive, even though it's easy to make, and the initial components are quite cheap. Why? Prohibition. The other side is going to argue that prohibition does not work. This is sort of a token, like, I don't know, totemic belief of the libertarians. It's not true, but they do believe it. Yet we can look at real-world legalizations to know that this is not the case. All sorts of goods are successfully prohibited, whether it be raw milk or fireworks or endangered species. More importantly, when you look at recent legalizations of raw milk or marijuana or sports gambling, we get the common sense result, which is that when you permit something, it becomes more widely consumed, and as a result, its harms are much more likely to obtain. The other argument that we heard tonight is that the side effects of prohibition are not worth it. They'll insist that all prohibition looks like sort of the worst excesses of the war on drugs, or they'll cherry pick terrifying stories about children being assaulted by DEA officers. But the broad spectrum of real-world prohibition should challenge this vision. Nobody is arrested for the sale of raw milk. And in the benighted days of 2017, when you could not sports gamble nationwide, there were just 2,000 gambling arrests, most of them not associated with sports betting. Even during high enforcement periods like the crack era war on drugs, only between 2 and 6% of drug incarcerees were unambiguously low-level first-time offenders. The reality is that even the most aggressive prohibition does not look like the boogeyman it is made out to be. Moreover, enforcement can be refined by policymakers. Legalization and the uncontrolled free market can't. So prohibition gets a bad rap. It's maligned as clunky, dumb, pointless. In reality, it's a simple, elegant tool for using one of government's worst qualities, the way that it makes markets work badly, to our collective advantage. So I encourage you to take the negative, and I look forward to a robust conversation.
Billy Binion from Reason. You have 4 minutes.
I'd like to start by talking about what ending the drug war is not. It is not an endorsement of drug use. It is not letting public spaces decay and turn into shanty towns. And it is not a refusal to enforce other criminal laws. In a New York Times piece 2 years ago, columnist Bret Stephens summed up his opposition to drug liberalization in a way that I think has come to epitomize why a lot of people oppose drug liberalization. The column was about 1,000 words, but I can sum it up in one: Portland. Over the course of the column, Stephens relied on anecdotes about troubling behavior in Portland, including public drug use, feces on the street, and a couple engaging in oral sex on a block between Target and Nordstrom, all of which he attributed to the city's lax drug laws. But what if I told you that those things effectively have nothing to do with each other? In recent years, we've seen a strange conflation between legalizing drugs and legalizing crime generally, as if one requires the other. In the early 2020s, Multnomah County, where Portland is located, decriminalized the possession of small amounts of drugs. It also deprioritized prosecuting theft for anything under $1,000. Now, when I say legalize drugs, I do not mean legalize theft, because those things are totally unrelated. There is no reason why ending this failed war, which has cost over $1 trillion, requires abandoning laws that protect public order. We can and should enforce statutes against public drug use, sidewalk defecation, and public sex, which for the record is already illegal virtually everywhere. But we should also talk about what the drug war is. In a recent Substack post about housing policy, Charles astutely observed that the purpose of a system is what it does. The idea was coined by a British theorist named Stafford Beer, and the gist is that mission statements and intentions aren't worth very much. What really matters is what the system actually accomplishes reliably and repeatedly. That is its true function. The purpose of a system is what it does. I think that's wise. So let's talk about what this system does. We're told the drug war is about saving lives and curbing addiction. Yet what it does is drive users underground, where a total lack of quality control pushes them toward more addictive and deadlier substances like fentanyl. We're told the drug war is about helping kids. Yet what it does is break up families, sometimes depriving them of their parents, and expose them to dangerous substances too. Stores check ID, dealers do not. We're told the drug war is about public safety. Yet what it actually does is fuel violence, turf wars, organized crime, and cartels by giving them a monopoly on supply. And we're told the drug war is about protecting us. Yet what it actually does is erode civil liberties, militarize the police, lead to sometimes deadly raids on people's homes, sometimes at the wrong house, and empower the state to steal ungodly amounts of money, cars, and houses from people using something called civil forfeiture, which Jacob mentioned, the practice that allows law enforcement to seize people's assets, often without even charging them with a crime. The purpose of a system is what it does. This system, this war, steals, kills, and destroys communities as wars often do. Thus, that is its purpose, and it's time to end it.
Rafael Mangual, opening statement, 4 minutes.
Okay, I'm tempted to just say Portland and drop the mic, but I'm not going to. Okay, so I am here to argue that drugs are bad, and I'm going to start by highlighting the fact that somewhere around 77% of those who reported using heroin in the last year had a heroin use disorder, while only 33% of those who reported using alcohol in the last year had a alcohol use disorder. Now, our friends on the other side might suggest that these substances are mostly harmless, and I think it's worth noting that about 92% of the more than 100,000 overdose deaths seen in this country every year are unintentional. What does that mean? It means that the pursuit of the high for addicts is often so intense that it overrides our most basic survival instincts, leading many to tragically roll the dice with their lives. Now, they might be tempted to argue that the problem of overdoses would be cured by legalization because that would allow for more transparency with regard to things like purity and dosage. But an important counterpoint to that suggestion is found in the data on overdoses on perfectly legal prescription opioids, which saw overdose rates spike from about 1.5 per 100,000 at the turn of the century to just under 6 per 100,000 by 2024, a time frame in which the number of emergency room visits related to prescription opioid misuse spiked by more than 150%. So I'd like you all to consider the possibility that making similar and more harmful substances even more widely available than we made prescription opioids isn't actually a very good idea. Now, the fatal overdose toll is just one of a number of obvious societal harms that we would see if we legalize drugs. Another one is that we would see more consumption-related crime. Now, in 2016, the Bureau of Justice Statistics published a survey of prisoners in the U.S., and a whopping 39% of state prisoners reported being under the influence of drugs at the time that they committed the offense that they were serving a sentence for. Inmates serving time primarily for a violent crime, it was 35% reported using at the time of the offense. That same survey found that 40% of state prisoners met the diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder. In the general public, that number is only 16.5%. Now they might say, but what about all the people who are serving time for drug offenses without any other violence? Surely there's little public safety benefit associated with enforcement in their cases. Well, no, not quite. If you look at recidivism analyses published by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they show that about 75% of state prisoners who were released in 2008 after serving time for a drug offense were rearrested for at least one non-drug crime over a 10-year period. Over a third were rearrested for a violent crime specifically. Now, again, they say, well, that's because of prohibition, because with prohibition come violent black markets. Now, why are they violent? Because there aren't any legal dispute resolution mechanisms of which parties can avail themselves, and that's their story. But it's got some holes, right? First, it's not at all clear that the black market would disappear if we legalized drugs. Consider the fact that 60% of the pot sold in the United States is sold on the black market, despite the fact that a majority of Americans live in jurisdictions in which pot is legal. Second, they pretend that the only drug-related crime that matters is organized crime, which is why you heard about cartels. That's why they point to figures like Al Capone during the Prohibition era to make their case. But while organized crime did increase during alcohol prohibition, psychopharmacological crime decreased enough to actually outweigh the increase in organized crime, which is why we saw the results from prohibition see no net change in overall crime rates. Now, I also want to highlight, because I only have a few seconds, the potential harms to children. And what we see is consistent and significantly higher risks of things like sudden infant death syndrome for babies who were exposed to parental drug use while in utero. After birth, we see that children who survive infancy despite parental drug use see a range of life problems with respect to a whole host of outcomes. They have more behavioral problems, depression, anxiety, aggression, impulsivity, hyperactivity. They have reduced supervision levels, increased levels of family breakdown, lower family parent-child attachment, poor relationship development with their peers, right? So I think that's important. And finally, I think it's worth considering what we've already seen in the jurisdictions in which we moved toward legalization by reducing penalties for drug crimes and decriminalizing certain offenses. So yes, Portland, which by the way is in the state of Oregon, which decriminalized all drugs in 2020 via ballot initiative, and in 2024 recriminalized them. We've already done small versions of the massive social experiment that our opponents want us to do, and every time we've done it, it has gone badly. Please vote no, Portland.
Okay, so very broadly speaking, I think we can sort of we can summarize the two sides and their arguments here. There's a bunch of arguments that were made, but I think we can summarize this argument. The strongest points that I heard were, on the one side, drugs are harmful, and on the other side, prohibition is harmful. And I want in this next segment, I want our debaters to talk to each other and ask questions and press each other on these points. But I am going to start by taking my prerogative as moderator and asking a question or two, and in particular about the question, the idea that drugs are harmful, because this is something that Charles, you said that the other side would agree that drugs are harmful. And so just respond to that. Do you agree with Charles's characterization that drugs are harmful? And if so, how does that change your argument, Billy and Jacob? I think... you need to hold your microphone, sir?
I'm sorry. Hi. Yeah, so their drugs are not inherently harmful or inherently beneficial. They can be either one, depending upon context. They're obviously beneficial to a lot of people, or otherwise they wouldn't use them. People who clearly are deriving benefit from drug use, so it would be inexplicable that they use drugs. They also have hazards, no question about it. And I think part of our argument is that prohibition actually enhances those hazards. So if you look at overdoses, among people who use pharmaceutical opioids, legally produced opioids that are reliably dosed, you know what you're getting. Very, very small rate of fatal overdose among people who use those legally produced drugs compared to what you see with black market substances. And as I mentioned, you can see that pretty clearly in what happened after the crackdown on prescription painkillers. It was cut by about half. So that was a pretty big accomplishment, but at the same time, opioid-related deaths not only continue to go up, but the upward trend actually accelerated. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that people are moving from reliably dosed substances where they know what they're getting into a market where they have it's highly variable and unpredictable. And it could be accidental, but that's prohibition promotes accidents by creating all this uncertainty.
But couldn't it also be that the prescription opioids were just addictive enough that it created a problem that didn't go away once the prescription opioids were more heavily regulated? And so, I mean, we did see a nearly fourfold increase in overdoses on prescription opioids, which, as you said, were perfectly legal between the turn of the century, where the rate was 1.5 per 100,000, and 2024, where the rate had jumped to 5.9 per 100,000.
Yeah, typically those deaths involve mixtures of opioids or mixtures of drugs. Mixtures of drugs, not.
So when you say mixers, just clarify
Mixtures
exactly what you mean here.
Well, for example, it might be with alcohol, it might be with other depressants. In any case, I reject the premise that those drugs are powerfully addictive and irresistible or anything like that. How many people here have taken legally produced opioids? Raise your hand. And I won't ask you exactly why you took them, but did it end up destroying your life, or did you find that you could take or leave them? How many people had their lives destroyed?
I do think that most of the people in the audience, by definition.
Right,
this is an example of sample selection.
These are very widely used substances.
Yeah, but
and addiction is a relatively rare outcome among people for both
this is also,
medical and non-medical
but that's actually also true of the use of fentanyl, right? Indeed, my risk associated with the use of heroin, that's true. But if we want to, I don't know if we want to get bogged down in this question, but it seems to me like the relevant fact is not that today the OD death rate associated with opioids is much higher than it was at the peak of the prescription phase of the crisis, but that the 15 to 20,000 OD deaths from prescription opioids at the peak of that phase is way higher than the rate of OD deaths from heroin in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, and the 60s. Like, I tend to think that the explanation for that increase in deaths is largely unrelated to prohibition and control, but also you're not proposing making drugs like controlled substances like oxycodone is, right? You want them to be legalized. So I am skeptical of the claim that we should look at something like controlled medical substances and go, this should tell us a lot about what the black market does as compared to the white market, the illicit market, the retail market.
Well, I mean, so look at the alcohol market, right? So
which kills more people every year than all illicit substances combined.
We can get into the alcohol thing in a second.
Yeah.
I just want to illustrate this one point about predictability and certainty versus uncertainty. When was the last time you went to a liquor store and you bought a bottle that said it was 80 proof and it turned out it was 160 proof?
Yeah, but that's not actually
right?
the reason that people overdose, right? It's not that they don't know what they're dosing. This is a thing that people believed for about 3 years in the middle of the 2010s. But if you look at, for example, the expansion of fentanyl on the West Coast, people switched to fentanyl because fentanyl's a better product. And you can tell this because you ask people and they'll tell you, oh yeah, I like to use fentanyl. It shows up in surveys
Yeah,
too.
I think the research is at least mixed on that because people who were initially getting fentanyl as a booster or as a substitute, look, this isn't a systematic panel, but it's interviews by researchers asking people in these markets where fentanyl was emerging, is this something you prefer? Is this something you wanted?
It's true in the
And most of
2010s,
them
it's
did not prefer it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's...
So in that sense,
We're getting in the weeds. Sorry, Peter.
So it sounds like we have a quite strong disagreement about whether prohibition makes drugs less safe. And obviously Jacob thinks that prohibition just inherently makes drugs less safe, and you guys don't really buy that argument.
I think legalization makes drugs more potent, and we know this is true because we can look at the experience of legalization of marijuana of sports gambling, to some extent the psychedelics. Any potency effects, positive potency effect that comes from criminalization is swamped by the potency effects that comes when you're allowed to innovate on the quality of an addictive product, because the major thing that consumers of the addictive product want is potency.
Okay, but I'll push back on that a bit, because you look at the legal pot markets. Yeah. It's true. You see like super potent strains. One puff is enough, kids. One puff.
Don't eat the whole gummy
It's a
bear.
debate and an advice column.
But you also do see a range of potencies, both among the flour and among the food products, the beverages. You know, there was one company that was selling beverages, like a single serving of a soft drink is 5 milligrams, which is relatively low dose. Sometimes they have the little mints with like 2.5.
Of course.
milligrams. So in other words, you have a much wider range of choice. And it's not simply all about potency. It's about satisfying people's demands.
Right, but the people who actually do the lion's share of the consuming demand more potency over all other things. For example, there's a RAND survey of legalized users, I think Washington, where they say how much more would you be willing to pay for pot that had been checked for safety, lack of heavy metals, etc. And the answer is like $2 a gram. I think a third of users, and I get the number wrong, a third of users said they wouldn't pay any more. The overwhelming prioritization of people who are heavy users is that they want to consume more of the substance they're addicted to.
Okay, so I want to bring Billy in here, just try and get your perspective on some of this, right? Because you started your opening remark by talking about what ending the drug war is not. And you said, I believe it's not an endorsement of using drugs. And so how does your idea about about not using drug, right? Like, this isn't an endorsement of definitely using drugs. It's much more about the practical consequences. How does that play into the potency argument here? The idea that these guys are the argument that they are making, that if you legalize drugs, they will become much more potent and much more dangerous.
Well, I'll just start off by saying maybe Jacob and I diverge a little here, but I think there's nuance when you ask the question, are drugs inherently bad? I mean, I guess it depends on the drug. I mean, you acknowledge right away that alcohol is a drug.
It's bad.
I think say again?
It's bad.
Well,
it kills a lot of people.
I like wine.
Also, we'll be having some of that later.
I'm going to be having some after this. I think that it is, as a human race, we are always looking at the negatives. We see that with things like AI. We see that, I mean, when we talk about any of these things, we're always looking at the downsides. I think alcohol is not necessarily a net negative for us. We might disagree on that. I've had a lot of great times drinking my wine with my friends. And I think that counts for something. In terms of other drugs, I mean, I'm actually not really a drug user, with the exception of one. I like a shroom. But I don't use...
That's a Mario Brothers reference, just in case there's any DEA agents. I know we've got ATF not very far from here.
But I don't even really use weed anymore. I mean, I've never tried cocaine. I've never smoked a cigarette. So for me, I think this conversation, as many conversations, public policy conversations do become, it's become extremely binary between people who kind of run these cartoonishly progressive jurisdictions, and I don't mean to say that rudely, but there's a reason, at least in part, why places like Portland look the way they do, and it is because they do refuse to enforce public order. And I actually agree with you all, in some sense, that I am fine with enforcing a standard in public spaces. I think that is necessary, and I think that is good.
Here's the thing, though. I mean, there have been efforts to enforce in places like Portland and San Francisco, and sometimes they're temporary, and what we see is they can clean the street up, like when Xi Jinping's coming to town, But it doesn't take very long for the problem to reappear. And when you expand use rates and addiction rates and abuse rates the way that I think they'll be expanded if you go full throttle on legalization, what you're going to end up with is a much bigger public disorder problem that's going to need to consume many more police resources. And soon enough, you're going to be in a world in which that's almost everything that the police are doing. Now, in the country right now, we have a massive shortage in our police in terms of resources available for enforcement, which is why you're seeing curtailment in all sorts of areas. You're just going to get more of that, right? We don't want to live in a world in which police officers are literally spending 80% of their time clearing up the people who are doing heroin liens between parked cars on Kensington Avenue.
It is somewhat remarkable that the Reason magazine position here is there should be more policing of otherwise benign activity. We should have more cops out doing more enforcement in public for the benefit of it won't be criminalized to possess hard drugs. I don't really think this is net redounds to our benefit, but
that assumes though that there isn't already enormous law enforcement resources poured into our current apparatus. I mean, the 2023 statistic, there were almost 1 million arrests for drugs, and as Rafael mentioned, not all. Let me finish first. As Rafael mentioned, not all of those are just drugs, but some of them are. I mean, you could look at my good friend Carrie Blakinger, who works at the Houston Chronicle now. She was arrested because she was found walking around campus with heroin. She went to prison for years for that. These people matter too. The choice should not be Portland, where, I mean, ostensibly we're not enforcing much of anything, and some law enforcement officers will tell you that was a choice because they feel like the legislators there hamstrung them. And I'm not a progressive. I'm certainly not a Portland progressive. I'm not going to get on board with some of the, like I said, cartoonish ways that they have chosen to roll this out. But I don't think there's any evidence to say that would be 80% of what they were doing.
I mean, so we know from the experience of marijuana legalization, research from the Kansas City Federal Reserve shows that arrests increase. I think it's 11% following those total arrests, not marijuana arrests. Those go down. The total number of arrests increase following legalization. We know from the experience of Portland and Washington, this in forthcoming research that looks at the effects on crime, that a variety of kinds of crime increased in both Portland and Seattle compared to 23 other control states at the daily level, which means more aggressive policing was required. It is certainly the case that we allocate a lot of police resources to drugs, or at least a lot of arrests are labeled as being for drugs. There are harms to that. There are harms to all government policy. But our argument is, if you get rid of the thing that controls the source of the problems, i.e. prohibition, and you create you enhance the source of the problems, which is addiction to drugs and the sale of addictive drugs, then you will have to do more policing of the results, and that seems bad.
The difference is that prohibition is not getting rid of the problem, though. That assumes that it's getting rid of it, and it's not.
So this is where they play this game, where they sort of make the argument that prohibition doesn't work because it doesn't work perfectly. The question is not whether prohibition completely eliminates drug use and abuse. The question is, would legalization lead to more drug use and abuse? Right? We are not debating a proposition of whether or not we have the perfect drug regulation apparatus in place. We are debating whether we should get rid of it entirely and do a massive social experiment in which all prohibitions and all restrictions on drug use go away, and that would be insanity.
So this is where I will just say one thing to that, and sorry, I don't mean to monopolize it. This is where the idea, I think it is important for people to know, Jacob pointed out in the beginning, the vast majority of the people who try drugs do not get addicted. Do I concede that legalization will increase drug use? Of course it will. That's just life. But, there's a difference between doing cocaine at a party and becoming a coke addict.
So I want to move on just a little bit here. I think we've talked about some of the policing consequences, but these guys both, on the legalization side, they both offered a long list of practical consequences that went way beyond sort of the policing incarceration effects, including very specifically consequences for corruption, increasing corruption, civil liberties, asset forfeiture, right, enabling some of these policies that they said were a direct result of waging the drug war. And so just how do you guys respond to sort of this argument that very practically the drug war incentivizes having just sort of a much worse, much more corrupt public policy space?
Well, again, I mean, this is one of those times where I think it's important to point out that our position is not to defend the current prohibition system as perfect. I myself have written pretty extensively, although I think Charles and I part ways on this, that I don't think civil asset forfeiture is good. I don't think it should be done, right? So just as Billy says that, drug legalization. Thank you. Nice. I wasn't expecting an applause line in the Reason debate, but but just as Billy says that drug legalization doesn't necessarily mean you have to co-sign on all the disorder that we know is going to attend drug legalization, I would say that drug prohibition doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sign off on the most problematic enforcement mechanisms. And I would say that civil asset forfeiture is absolutely one of those. I think if you want to take somebody's property, you ought to charge them with a crime.
I just think it's a bizarre theory that public corruption on the part of the state is downstream of the war on drugs as opposed to it being the state. My response, I don't really talk about civil asset forfeiture because it's far afield. If we can get into the nitty gritty, I sort of agree with Al. But the institution of civil asset forfeiture still exists if we legalize drugs. The cartels still exist if we legalize drugs. They're actually quite diverse businesses at this point. They do a variety of things. Foreign corruption still exists if we legalize drugs. And indeed, part of the experience of legalization, to Ralph's point, is that you can end up in an equilibrium where illicit distributors are better off, as they are in many pot legalization states, than they were under prohibition. That isn't guaranteed, but it is a thing that happens with some routine frequency.
So do you guys buy any of this? I mean, do you think that there's any merit to any of this?
Yeah, look, obviously you're still going to have official corruption even if you legalize drugs, but it is a driver, like as was noted during alcohol prohibition, of police corruption. I mean, it creates opportunities that would not exist but for prohibition.
But every law has
and
that
also in terms of civil asset forfeiture, actually with that, this is really the main driver of the use of civil asset forfeiture, the excuses that police use. They bring in a drug sniffing dog. It supposedly reacts to your car. Now they're searching your car. Now maybe they find some cash and they're going to take it, and the burden's on you to get it back, and so forth. That's very routinely driven by drug law enforcement. Same with all these Fourth Amendment cases. So you could say, well, yes, police will still be, tempted to violate the Fourth Amendment. Police will still be tempted to take bribes, and they still might want to use civil asset forfeiture. But the point is that the incentive for doing these things and the opportunity is much less in the absence of prohibition.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would say that it's much less, but I also think it's worth pointing out that, especially with respect to civil asset forfeiture, we have seen changes over the last, decade. In terms of that practice. I mean, one of the most problematic aspects of civil asset forfeiture is what's called the equitable sharing program, where state law enforcement agencies are encouraged, they're given a federal incentive to act as federal officers and engage in asset forfeiture, and then they get a kickback from the federal government with respect to what they take. Now, the equitable sharing program was killed under Obama and was reinstituted in 2016 when President Trump took office. And that was when I wrote in opposition to that move. But the fact is that it did go away for a number of years, irrespective of the fact that drugs were still prohibited.
I just want to say one thing about asset forfeiture. I remember on Twitter or X or whatever you're supposed to call it, Charles, you said something along the lines that, asset forfeiture is just a libertarian obsession, but they're mostly just stealing guns and drugs, which is simply not true, and is belied by all the data. The vast majority of stuff seized via asset forfeiture is cash, usually under $1,000. But for certain people, and they can also seize cars, they can seize homes. There's a woman right now in Oklahoma who allegedly made meth in her home. She's trying to make sure she's not homeless now. And I think what often does not or is not injected enough into this conversation is that for some people, losing your car, losing your home, losing your cash, your life savings, even just $1,000, it makes life really hard to support yourself, to get to work. And you know what people who are homeless and can't work and don't have any money do? A lot of times they're driven to drugs.
Okay, we do need to move on now. Like I said at the beginning, this is a serious, wonky policy debate. You can tell, right? And we're going to try to keep it mostly sober-minded, but maybe the emphasis there is on mostly, because this is a reason debate as well, which means it is now time for us to play a game. So most of you have probably heard of a party game that I am not going to say the name of, but we'll call it Screw, Marry, Kill, right? Okay, everybody knows this game. Well, we're going to play a version of that game for drug policy that we are going to call Legalize, Regulate, Ban. So next to me here, I have 2 bags that are full of names of drugs and drug-like substances. We just keep these sorts of things around at the Reason office. And each team, we're going to go back and forth, and each team is going to have an opportunity to pick 3 out of each of these bags. And then they're going to have to pick one of the substances to legalize, one to regulate, and one to ban. You cannot legalize everything, Jacob and Billy. You cannot ban everything. How the regulate question, I understand regulation is complicated. So part of what you're going to have to do here is make your argument for why you're picking these 3. Hopefully you're going to do so in a way that helps advance your argument, helps us understand exactly how you are thinking. You're going to get 90 seconds for each round here. And so we're going to start with City Journal, and we're going to start with a bunch of substances that are legal. Let's call them legal-ish. I think we can see them on the screen behind me now. Okay, so what do we have? What are our options here? We've got, let's see, we've got Sudafed, Ozempic, espresso martinis, terrible, mango jewel vapes, CBD gummies, Plan B Adderall, and Whippets. It's a big night for Whippets. All right, so here's what you guys have to do. You pick 3 out of here. As you pick them, remember, you don't put the names back in the bag. Tell us what you get, and then you get 90 seconds to discuss. You can do anything you want. You just have to do it on microphone. You can ask the audience. You can ask Jacob and Billy here, but you have to then give me an answer. What are you going to legalize? What are you going to regulate? And what are you going to ban? Here's the bag. Let's pick 3. No choice selecting. All right.
I got 3. I didn't see what they were. Okay, we have Sudafed, ban.
Sudafed.
Oh, wait, no.
I mean, if that's the...
Yeah, no, Sudafed. Oh, no, Adderall, ban Adderall. That's easier.
Sudafed, Adderall.
Yeah, regulate Sudafed, because most of the problem with Sudafed is precursor. And Whippets. Oh.
And Whippets. Wow,
yeah.
Such a great night for
It's a hard
Whippets.
one. You definitely want to ban
You got to
Adderall.
get pretty fat to get to the Whippet, though, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you got to eat a lot of whipped cream.
Whippets is a pain. Like in terms of dose, I don't know. I would regulate Whippets. I would legalize Sudafed. Well, it depends. Over the counter. I
then
don't know. I
ban
liked having
Adderall?
one. I liked having over the counter.
What is Adderall really like? Has anyone taken Adderall?
Dextromethamphetamine.
Many
It's a
take Adderall.
racemic salt. You'll basically be fine. It will make you
Jacob over here
crazy.
says it's excellent.
It will make you crazy on the long term.
Okay.
Also, you substitute from amphetamine. It's not great. No, you totally
Yeah, well, I
ban
know
amphetamine.
Sudafed, pseudoephedrine is a precursor for meth, so that's probably worth regulating.
the thing is, the Mexicans are way better at making meth by the traditional route now.
Right,
So
they
like
don't use, yeah.
homemade shake and bake meth is just like it's an inferior product. So I take Sudafed because I don't like having a cold. And I
Wait,
would
so
like to
you
have
take
access-
Sudafed?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
let's just...
I do too.
want to make sure everybody
Yeah.
heard.
Yeah. And Whippets, I feel like I don't know what's involved in regulating Whippets. Like you got to put a protective canister.
I don't know.
on
Whipped
the
cream's
top.
pretty delicious. I don't know if I want to regulate that.
Not regulate
It's
it.
the end of a whipped cream can, folks.
It takes a lot of effort. Okay,
Yeah,
no,
I
so we can
don't-
put.
Okay,
All
so
right,
we
let's
have
legalize
25
Whippets.
seconds.
Let's legalize Whippets.
Let's get
Legalize
to the answer.
Whippets. We'll regulate Sudafed and ban Adderall.
Yeah, that's
There
it.
we go.
All right. Let's see. So we have 5 substances left. Let's pull 3 out of the bag here from our group of legal-ish substances. What did we get? Yeah, just pick 3 and then tell me what they are.
Ozempic,
Okay, we've got Ozempic. Huh. That's illegal. We're in trouble.
espresso martini is my favorite
Espresso-
cocktail.
All right. Definitely not my favorite cocktail.
Well, it's
but-
mine.
Ban. Absolutely. That's easy.
And
This
Plan
is the-
B.
And Plan B. Okay, so let's see. Ozempic, espresso martinis, and Plan B. What are we going to do? We've got 90 seconds.
You don't agree on banning this.
No, I wanted
You
like
like
I
them.
wanted
You like
ASAP.
them. 'Cause I don't approve of them. Do we want to pretend to be anti-abortion and then we can ban that?
Sure.
We're going to pretend to be anti-abortion. We're going to ban that.
Okay,
And
we're definitely banning Plan B. We agreed on this?
apparently.
All right.
And
you have to make a choice here. It's tough, policy making.
Ozempic, we're gonna over the counter, so
Yes.
that's legalized.
I
I'll
like-
call that legalized. And then espresso martinis, I think you should have to write an essay explaining why you need to consume this product when there's so many better cocktails available to you.
You will be able to discuss this with Jacob at a bar after this event. We'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so that's the first 2 rounds here. We've got 2 more rounds. And for this, we've got a bunch of substances that are, let's say they're pretty illegal. So we've got fentanyl, crack, marijuana, magic mushrooms, meth, heroin, ketamine, and toad venom. Toad venom, which, if you've seen the movie Friendship, there's a fantastic scene. Apparently, it makes you hallucinate that you're going to Subway. All right, so we're going to start with you guys this time, and so pick 3, and then you're going to have to ban some of these or one of them.
Magic mushrooms.
Okay, magic mushrooms is number 1. Meth.
Crack.
And crack. Magic mushrooms, meth, and crack. Where are we going? Where are
We're
we going to go with
absolutely
this?
legalizing magic mushrooms. I'm sorry.
You did say this was the drug of choice for you.
It is my drug of choice.
Yes, these are great. I highly recommend them. They're really good.
So your method here is entirely a personal preference?
But
Okay. This may tell us
I mean,
something
also,
about
all
how...
shrooms do is make you feel like euphoric and like you can,
They will make you seriously
Feel light on
mentally
your
ill.
toes.
They will make you seriously
can
mentally
we ban
ill.
meth if we allow?
You need some magic mushrooms to relax a
If
little
we
bit.
have legalized like over-the-counter access to Adderall and other stimulants,
Correct.
we could probably do without meth.
So
What do you think?
you're going to ban meth technically while leaving
Leaving
meth-like
like
substances?
competing stimulants freely available.
Which means we're regulating crack?
So,
I guess?
yeah, maybe some labeling.
All right. Put it behind the
think?
counter like Sudafed.
Oh, don't sell it to kids. That's
There you
regulated.
go. There you go. Okay. So we got 3 more here
All right.
from our very much not legal, pretty illegal set of substances.
1, 2.
This is the whole
2.
problem with this. Is there's no such thing as legal and illegal. It's controlled or not controlled. It's not how law
Let's
works.
see what we've got. Our 3 substances.
Okay, we got ketamine,
Ketamine,
fentanyl,
fentanyl,
regulate.
and Mary J.
and marijuana.
God,
Okay.
they're all downers. I was hoping for an upper. I guess we didn't have that many
You
options left.
have 90 seconds
All right, well, I
to
think it's
decide
easy.
here.
We ban fentanyl. That kills a shit ton of
No,
people.
you regulate fentanyl. Fentanyl's actually like quite useful. It's way more usful than pot.
But ketamine's also
I would
useful
ban
in the
pot.
hospital setting.
Ketamine, no, because ketamine has antidepressant effects. Ban pot. There are upsides to ketamine.
Wait, no, I
going
don't
for
think I
pot.
want to ban pot. I honeymooned in Jamaica.
It's the most harmful drug up here. They can't tell if I'm joking or not.
I do like that we've got you making the case for fentanyl here.
Yeah.
Like
It's a painkiller.
this is apparently the reason why we've got
but
tariffs.
I'm
It's-
pro fentanyl lollipops. They're for kids with cancer. Why are you not? How can you
I
be
had
against
ketamine
that?
in a
That's
hospital.
right.
That was
Give
pretty good.
fentanyl to the children.
No,
is
here's
now...
what it is. You legalize ketamine because it facilitates Elon Musk's process, and that's very
Okay,
important for
there
getting
you
to
go,
Mars.
yeah.
So legal ketamine.
We're really gonna
regulate fentanyl because you
and
want
ban-
access in a medical
ban
context.
pot.
You know, people take it and ban pot. Yeah, there's
right,
no upside
whatever.
to legal pot. So
None of this counts.
Okay. All right. That was fun. I think we learned. Well, I'm not sure. I hope we learned something here. In any case, you can factor those decisions into your vote when we get to the end. All right. Let's move on to our next segment. Our debaters have made their opening statements. They have argued amongst themselves, and they have played a game. But now I want to give you in the audience a chance to ask them questions. In theory, we have a microphone coming down to the center here. And so what I want you to do is actually to get in line. I see some hands up, but actually just get up, get in line in the front of the microphone here, in front of everyone. If we've only got one person, we'll only answer one question, but you can, we have a bunch of time here, a bunch of minutes where you can ask the debaters questions. Now, before we start the questions, something I want to tell you is if you listen to the Reason Roundtable, the podcast that I host, I like questions that are short and succinct and pithy and not very long. That's short, succinct, pithy, and not very long questions. And I also like them to be questions. So please ask your short, succinct, not very long, pithy question. Sir.
At what age do these drugs become legal? Where's the age of consent here for this team and for that team? Where do you feel?
Okay, let's start with you because I think it's a harder question for the pro-legalization side. Is are age limits part of your legalization plan?
I mean, I can't speak for Billy, but I tend to think that we should favor one somewhat arbitrary definition of adulthood for most, if not all, purposes. I think it's insane to let people buy guns but not beer, to make them they can serve in the army, they can get married, they can sign contracts, but they can't go in a casino because they're serving liquor there. That seems absurd. I think it has bad results when you have college students, most of whom are not of legal age to drink, when they're going to be drinking. That's not a good solution that is conducive to responsible behavior. So I would tend to, I don't know, 18 is quite conventional. There are people who object that, brain is still developing at that age and maybe it should be 21. But whatever the hell it is, first of all, it should be younger than me. And second of all, I think we should try to be consistent. If what we're saying is, at this age, we expect you to be able to make your own choices by and large, although you still might screw up, I think we should try to be consistent. So I would be comfortable with something in the 18 to 21 year range, but we should try to be consistent across different fields.
Do we need to answer?
Unless you guys really want to go here, we've got a long line, so let's try and get through as many questions as possible here. Sir?
Hey, thank you. Are any of you familiar with the rat park study?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't trust science from the 70s.
And what do you think about that?
Okay, so let's. Someone needs to explain because I am not familiar with this.
So the idea is that rats are like people, and this is externally valid because that's how they did science in the 1970s. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you want to explain what it was, or do you want me to?
You can do it.
Billy,
So the rat park study was essentially they put a bunch of rats they made them lonely, they siloed them, and they offered, I think, small quantities of heroin or some opioid. And essentially what the researcher, I forget his name, but what he concluded...
Bruce Alexander.
Oh, you know this too. What he concluded was that rats were far less likely to return to the heroin when they had stimulation from other rats around them, friendship, camaraderie, however that works when you're a rat.
And also the environment.
And the idea, the conclusion, and I mean, people can argue it, contest it, whatever, is that a lot of drug use is driven by trauma, by loneliness, escapism, and when you take away what is hurting people, whatever that might be, we all have different definitions of trauma. We all are dealt a different deck of cards in life. But some people, unfortunately, when bad things happen to them, they react by using drugs.
If drugs are good for rats, according to science, or maybe a sign of trauma, does that tell us anything?
I mean, yes, it's true that adverse experiences prior to drug use are a risk factor for subsequent drug use and addiction. Lots of other things are risk factors too. Genes are risk factors. Your environment is a risk factor. Your peers are risk factors.
Exposure to drug use.
Yeah. So the number one risk factor for becoming addicted to drugs is exposure to and use of drugs. Like, it's just, and my objection to the trauma framing, in addition to the fact that it's often peddled by quacks, is that it is deeply condescending to the people whose real and severe addiction problems proceed from their exposure to drugs, who otherwise have non-traumatic upbringings, non-traumatic experiences, and nonetheless suffer substantially. And to tell them that the problem is that they are broken in some way is, I think, deeply disrespectful.
I think that the broader point, which I think you guys would more or less concede, is that this is not simply a matter of adding a drug to a person. All of these other factors are crucial. The individual, their circumstances, social circumstances, economic circumstances, family circumstances, their period in life. There are people who will go, drink abusively during one period, college possibly, and then be fine later and drink in moderation. This is a familiar sort of thing. People grow out of what seem to be quite tenacious drug habits, including, smoking, including heroin, when they get to a certain point in their life where their circumstances have changed in a way that makes that feasible for them.
Can I say one quick thing?
Real quick, but then we need to grow out of this circumstance in our
really
life.
Quickly. Obviously, some people use drugs not because of trauma, but I do not think it is offensive to acknowledge that some people turn to escapist substances when they've had bad things happen to them. That's not a blanket. it doesn't apply to everyone, but it does apply to some.
Sir?
Hey, thank you guys for this. I'll show my cards. I work for an anti-drug legalization group, so that's where I'll come at it from. Just to be transparent. My question, I think the one kind of big like elephant in the room that I found was omitted tonight was alcohol and tobacco. And I would just ask, I guess, maybe moderator, whoever you think would be best equipped, but I guess maybe more aimed to the Reason guys, saying that, it's quite miraculous that alcohol on a kind of almost a one-to-one level and tobacco one-to-one is less dangerous than many, many other substances. Yet it is, they are two of the leading causes of death, right? And I would just, I guess, ask how you would account for the fact that we have two long-term historical examples with maybe more research points than any other drug, and they basically all point to the fact that it is going terribly when you commercialize them.
So I believe Charles actually said that he thinks alcohol is bad. It kills a lot of people. I don't know exactly what the policy position is, but let's go to the Reason side here.
Look, I think that all of these issues, all these concerns that people have about drugs, essentially all of them can be raised with equal or greater force against alcohol. Whatever the concern is you might have about social impact, about addiction, about certainly, the biological effects of heavy use and so forth, traffic accidents, all this, even like committing crimes under the influence of it, that sort of thing. So I guess the question then is, does that mean, and it'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say about this. Does that mean alcohol also should be illegal? Given all of these, potential harms, or not, and if not, why not? I mean, to me, morally, it's identical. Morally, you're talking about alcohol versus heroin. I mean, look, there's things to be said about heroin over alcohol in terms of long-term use is much less biologically harmful if you have heroin that's a reliable supply and you know what you're taking, whereas, heavy alcohol use wrecks the body. Yeah. So there are things to be said. Maybe heroin should be legal and alcohol should be legal.
I think
that's the game.
I think it's absolutely the case that alcohol is an incredibly harmful substance, but our job here today isn't to say whether or not we should exacerbate the problems that are already associated with alcohol by legalizing all drugs and adding more into that particular cocktail. I think that would be a disaster, right? I think our position on prohibition is that, like everything else, right, prohibition is a rule of law that is done by the consent of the governed. Right now, the governed have decided that they want to legalize alcohol. That may or may not be a bad idea. I think it's probably on net a pretty bad one, but that's not our job tonight. Our job tonight is to say whether or not we should get rid of society's decision to prohibit the other drugs that are not yet legal. And I think adding to the problems of alcohol by doing away with the prohibitions on all these other substances would be just an absolute disaster.
Again, I hope you will all join us for a drink after the debate. Let's get to our next question.
Can I just say one thing about that question really quick?
Sure, very quickly.
Yes,
Short, succinct,
I just want
pithy,
to
and not very long.
Yes, I get that alcohol poses a lot of problems in society. I will also say we tried prohibiting it and it went disastrously.
It went great.
No, it
really
did.
It really
it
did
depends
work.
on what your,
really worked.
It very much depends on what your metric of success is. If your metric of success is no one's drinking anymore, okay, great. But the people who were drinking things like rot gut, where people were going blind from drinking stuff that was contaminated.
Totally.
And to your point about tobacco as well,
This is empirically false.
in the 50s, it was seen as real cool to smoke tobacco. I have never smoked a cigarette. I mentioned that earlier because we went through decades of public health telling people that it was bad to do this. By the time I got to college, I honestly just thought it was disgusting. Sorry for the smokers. It never appealed to me.
And
so it is possible to do that with other substances.
Right, and today it kills 4 times as many people as all other illegal drugs combined. So it kind of worked a little bit, but not really.
Okay, next question here.
Hi, Jacob.
Hi, Charles.
We've debated. We've debated. Before.
Okay, let's tell everyone who you are.
So just putting it out there, I do work at Reason, so I'm biased as well.
He knows I'm right, so.
Well, we'll see. We just put out a new analysis, and as you suspected, when you legalize drugs, more people use them. We've legalized marijuana, more people have used them. Maybe we've seen some issues with mental illness there as well. But one thing that also happens is that homicides go down. Is there... maybe we could debate whether that's true or not. But if there is some aspect of it, of law enforcement being able to focus their resources or there just being fewer black markets. Does that play into your cost-benefit analysis of more
I don't
people
know if it's fair
using versus law enforcement resources?
So your argument is that you have some data that says that if pot is legalized, then murder goes down. And this is also an argument
Yes.
that gets made about the end of alcohol prohibitions, that it was associated with criminality, including a lot of murder.
Yeah, I mean, well, the suggested mechanism at play here is that police are able to focus on more serious kinds of crime, but that misapprehends how police get at more serious crime, right? I mean, one of the things that we at the Manhattan Institute are really well known for is the idea of broken windows policing, which is rooted in the idea that when you police lower levels of criminal conduct and antisocial behavior, what you come across are more serious criminal offenses. Police officers don't go out and find murderers by stopping them in their tracks as they're getting ready to kill people, right? They reduce murder by taking people off the street for other crimes that are less hidden, right? So when they make a traffic stop and they find drugs, they take the guy out of the car and they pat him down. They find the gunner, they find the open warrant, and that guy maybe goes to prison for a while. And while he's incapacitated, he doesn't commit the murder that he would have otherwise committed. The idea that by taking drug enforcement off the table, we're, suddenly translating all of those resources into homicide investigations and taking serial killers off the street is just, there's no evidence to support that.
Okay, next question.
I could ask a really complicated policy question, but I'm not going to do that.
Thank you.
Two of you on stage have really cool kinds of facial hair. Two of you don't. Do you think there's this kind of debate between whether or not we can have fully legalized drugs versus liberalization? Like, obviously, some drunk guy stumbling on the streets of DC is not the same thing as someone smoking weed and and smelling it in New York or seeing it in New York versus someone shooting up heroin in San Francisco. And what do you kind of think is the debate between all of those?
So is your question that there are different types of disorderly drug use that we should sort of be considering, and does that change the calculus of legalization or not?
Basically.
Okay. Billy, Jacob, right? So if we've got different types of drug use, and sometimes they are more disorderly, and sometimes this is just sort of part of social life, does that change anything for you? Does that tell us anything about your argument for legalization?
I mean, I've already talked a lot about my views on public order. I'll let Jacob answer.
I essentially agree with Billy on that, except that there are certain value judgments that need to be made in that process of deciding what is disorder, right? What is behavior that's not appropriate in public. So I'm not sure we should be arresting a guy for sitting on a stoop and drinking a beer, for example.
And we don't do that.
Like
right?
that is not, but it can be done, right? And maybe you would catch some real bad guys then in the process.
Perhaps, yeah.
Who might have committed murder. But, right, so I'm not sure about, but obviously, a lot of people don't like the smell of pot, right? And that's, to the extent that's pervasive in city centers, I could see that people would consider that a nuisance, and that at least a partial solution to that is to have more places where people can privately consume, because it's very hard to get these started, and states were very slow to license establishments that are basically like cannabis cafes, that sort of thing. So I think people can have legitimate objections to certain smells and sights and sounds, and there might be a legitimate argument for regulation, but people probably are going to differ on the details.
Yeah, but I think it is important to, let's talk about New York for a second, right? Because whenever I talk to people at marijuana legalization in New York, which I do a lot because my employer is in New York and they legalized pot there and it smells all the time everywhere. People complain about this to me. What I tell them is that smoking pot in public in New York is illegal. It's illegal under the Bloomberg-era clean air laws, which can be enforced by the city at any time. They can ticket people. They can do what you guys would like to have happen, right? They could do enforcement, and they don't. And the question is why? Why don't they enforce them? There's laws. Why is it that they're willing to go after somebody who's smoking a cigarette in public, but not a joint? And the answer to that question is the legalization is the culmination of a multi-decade campaign that had as its object the argument that opposition to marijuana and its prohibition was illegitimate, irrational, immoral, and racist. You cannot, in the way that you would like to, decouple drugs from their consequences. You cannot decouple legalization from the context in which it happens. And so, perhaps we could subdivide the different kinds of disorder and argue this one should be legal and this one should not be legal, but that's not actually how law enforcement works. And when the state says this substance is permitted for retail sale, it loses a great deal of the moral authority required to say, but you can't smoke it in the park and blow the smoke in my 4-year-old's face.
All right, we have 3 or 4 more questions, and we have 3 or 4 more minutes left. So let's make these quick.
There's proof that psychedelics have been used for thousands of years in Latin America, Africa, parts of the Caribbean, and as well as Europe. And culture now becoming more conservative has pushed people away from utilizing drugs in safer spaces. Do you believe that with the liberalization of drugs and when we see the opening of clinics for people to use things such as ketamine here in DC and psychedelic therapy, which has been proven to be more effective than most medicines in treating addiction, PTSD, and adverse mental health disorders. Do you think that that would lead to safer consumption if we allow for the liberalization rather than the prohibition, which drives people to black markets? Research also suggests that people are willing to pay more money to get goods that are procured in a white market legally.
So what about medical psychedelics and the history of using them?
So my answer to that question is that I favor the medicalization of certain psychedelic substances for valid indicated purposes. And by that I mean I favor their medicalization, right? So I think they should be Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 substances. They should be available under a licensed physician's care. That's not what legalization has looked like. I can go to the state of Oregon right now, and I'm much more likely to contract with a self-identified shaman than I am with a doctor. I can go to Colorado, I can score a lot of shrooms and do them, but if I subsequently dissociate or decompensate and become seriously mentally ill, a real risk with psychedelic use, there's not going to be a licensed physician involved in that process. So yeah, this is the canard of medicalization as sort of the Trojan horse for legalization, right? Same argument was made with pot. It has medical indications. I mean, the case is actually weaker with pot. There really aren't very many medical indications. The case is stronger with psychedelics, but we have a whole system for controlling medical access to otherwise risky, harmful substances. It's the schedule of controlled substances, and it doesn't mean that shamans get to hand them out. So that's what's happening.
Next question.
I support you going to a shaman.
Hey, so to know whether I should vote in favor of legalizing all drugs, I need to know what a drug is. Because I'd need to be in favor of legalizing like every single one of them, which gives the opposition, obviously, an insanely massive advantage. You came close to addressing this in relation to alcohol and some other things, but I still don't know what any of you fundamentally thinks is and isn't a drug.
It's an addictive, harmful substance.
Like, what about listening to Mozart? I mean, that's an
it's not a substance. It's also not addictive. It's also not harmful.
So, yeah, I mean, anyway,
it's an addictive, harmful substance.
Okay,
I
that's
think
one
it's
of
a
you
mistake
in
to
simple
see-
terms to both sides.
I don't think
addictiveness
is a property of a substance. I think anything that
Physicians
is a
disagree with you.
source of pleasure or stress relief can become the focus of an addiction, which may be a life-disrupting addiction or not.
So
it might
one
be
of
an
my
addiction
friends who's cooler
that
than
on
me-
balance is a good thing. What?
One of my friends who's cooler than me tells me that MDMA is not addictive. So is that not a drug?
Your friend is wrong.
Okay,
It
fine.
is not. I'm sorry, I can't.
Are there some?
She has a friend who says
MDMA,
is
they're
not
trying,
addictive.
they're trying to make it into a prescription.
Or what if they made it
drug.
non-addictive? Would it then still be okay? I mean, I just don't know what any of you fundamentally counts as a drug or not.
Addiction is characterized by continued use and spread of negative consequences. There are a whole class of substances which are reliably or predictably addictive. You can theoretically describe addiction to anything, but it doesn't really happen. And so to the extent that addiction is a syndrome, i.e. a predictable pattern of behaviors, it's not coherent to talk about addiction to Mozart, right? Like you can go look in the DSM. That's why I gave you the definition that I did. It's because it's a commonly accepted definition. I use the word substance because we don't talk about, there are addictive, harmful practices, gambling, pornography use, but we're not talking about them here. So addictive, harmful substance.
Okay, we have time for one very, very quick question.
Do humans have the right to put in their body any substance they want? Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no tradition of right that says that's true up until about 3 minutes ago, so no.
It's your body. It's your body.
Okay, that is a good note to end on. That clarifies things here. I want to remind you that we will be going to a bar afterwards where you will be able to ask your questions to the debaters, where you will be able to make them not so short, not so pithy, not so succinct. They don't even have to be questions. You're just going to be able to talk. All right, we're going to finish out our debate here with some closing statements. They are going to be 2 minutes each, just 2 minutes. Please keep to your time. And once again, we are going to start with Reason. Pick your fighter.
Okay, that last question was a good setup because I think we should return to this notion, which I believe, but my opponents may not, that people, should be sovereign over their own bodies and minds, that they should be able to control what goes into their bodies. As long as they respect other people's rights, the government shouldn't be violently interfering with them. And we have to think seriously about what sort of problem is required to justify the use of force by the government, which regularly leads to horrifying results, like people being shot dead by police because they were awakened in the middle of the night and they went and got their gun because they thought they were burglars. Or little kids, in this horrifying case I mentioned, being maimed by a flashbang over a $50 meth sale. What kinds of problems are appropriately solved by violence in this way, and what kinds are not? And I would argue that the sorts of problems that result from your own decisions with respect to your own body that don't violate anyone's rights are not the government's business, and certainly not something that justifies the use of force or the use, the threat of violence or the use of violence. And that's the bottom line for me. I do also think there are all sorts of bad practical consequences, that flow from using violence in that way. But that's the basic moral issue. And it's the same with respect to alcohol as it is with any other psychoactive substance. If you have moral objections to banning alcohol, you ought to have moral objections to banning other drugs as well.
Okay, City Journal, 2 minutes for a final statement.
So I think it's important to just recognize that this idea of bodily autonomy really shouldn't extend to a problem like addiction, because at the end of the day, an addict really doesn't have the capacity to make rational decisions about what he or she does or doesn't put into their own bodies. It's why over 100,000 people overdose in this country. It's why a 62-year-old retiree might, on an occasion when his wife is out of town, experiment with a level of OxyContin that he's been taking for 20 or 30 years, to the point that he overdoses in his sleep and passes away despite being a functioning addict, the way that I had a family member pass away relatively recently. The idea that enforcement of prohibition automatically means the most heinous uses of force is just nonsense. We prohibit all sorts of conduct in the United States. Very few people go to prison or jail for the vast majority of offenses that are criminally enforceable in this country. The police use deadly force in about 0.003% of all arrests that they effect. They use physical force of any kind, deadly and non-deadly, in about 1 to 3% of all arrests that they effect, depending on what jurisdiction you're looking at, right? The idea that the choice is between armed men with guns kicking in your door, which almost never happens, and the sort of thing that we see in Portland, the latter is significantly more likely to come to pass. As I've said in my opening statement, we've already done this experiment. We've done it at smaller scales, and several times in very different parts of this world. It has never, ever, ever gone the way our opponents say it will. Thank you.
Billy?
I would like to start by saying that we actually have never tried this experiment because Portland was decriminalization, which is in some ways the worst of both worlds. You are giving people access to a supply that is still not regulated and just kind of turning a blind eye to people who have small amounts of drugs. It's not the same thing, and don't let people tell you that it is. But one thing I believe very deeply comes from one of my favorite economists, Thomas Sowell, who said something that has come to define the way I view the world, which is that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Nothing could be more relevant to this debate than that. I don't disagree that there are downsides to legalizing drugs. You will see increases in use. The smell in some cities is a nuisance. But those things are vastly outweighed by the cons of prohibition, much of which the public never sees. It understandably inspires a visceral and emotional response to see people on the sidewalk on drugs. But what you don't see is the violence and crime from monopoly control led by cartels and organized criminals. You don't see the families broken up by what is sometimes violent and disparate enforcement, including people whose sole crime is putting something in their body, which I believe they have the right to do, even if it's a bad choice. And you don't see people like Regina Nicholas and Dennis Tuttle, who Charles will say I'm cherry picking, but who were killed in their home during a no-knock raid after a crooked cop lied about a heroin purchase that never happened. You don't see that many people who've had their home, their car, their cash seized on suspicion of a drug crime, which can ruin their ability to support themselves and drive them to use more drugs. A lot of people don't realize that heroin was legal in the early 1900s. Banning it was a well-intentioned and what I would argue progressive response to what lawmakers saw as an addiction problem, most of which was among middle and upper-class women who were getting their dose at the pharmacy. We banned it, and the result has been entirely predictable and catastrophic, as we saw with alcohol prohibition. I'll end with this. William Wilberforce was a member of Parliament in the 18th century, a devout Christian, and by today's standards, a drug addict. He used opium daily. But he was also the man who helped bring down the transatlantic slave trade. Under modern drug laws, it's quite possible he would have been arrested, jailed, and written off as a common criminal. Thank you.
Charles Lehman, you have 2 minutes for the final closing statement.
The reason that we banned drugs in the early 20th century was not because of benign addiction among middle-aged women, mostly in the South, by the way. It was because of that population, but it was far from benign. First of all, it was that population, people who returned from the Civil War, people across the West Coast, including many recent Chinese immigrants, who are suffering from profound and debilitating and often dysfunctional addiction. We did the same thing for cocaine. We did the same thing for heroin. And when we did that, the problem dramatically diminished. Indeed, drug overdose deaths by reasonable measures declined more or less continuously from initial prohibition through the 1950s. It was a success. What we see everywhere that we have tried the liberalization of substances is that not only does use grow, but the harms of substances grow. It happened in Portland when we decriminalized. I've been there. It was not pleasant. Happened in Seattle. It happened in British Columbia, which is why all 3 jurisdictions have recriminalized possession. It happens when we legalize relatively benign substances, marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, the harms grow. And for every story that you can tell about somebody who did not deserve to be hurt by the police, who should not have been hurt by the police, for every story that we can tell about those people, I can tell you 10 about the people whose families were destroyed, whose lives were wrecked, who lost their lives to drugs. Drugs destroy the societies that they touch. We learned this lesson 100 years ago. Every 50 years or so, we have to relearn it. I think we are relearning it now a little bit faster than last time, but it doesn't make it any less true. That's what drugs do.
All right, folks, that is our debate. That's right. Let's give a hand to our debaters, Charles Fain Lehman from the Manhattan Institute, Rafael Mangual, Jacob Sullum, Billy Binion. All right, so it is now time to vote again. Get out your phones. We're going to bring up some instructions on the screen here. You are going to get to decide who is the winner. And while you are voting, we're going to go over something really important here, because your vote won't just determine the winner of this important and serious and wonky policy debate. It's also going to determine who gets the prizes, because we have prizes here. Okay, let's go through these while we figure out who's going to get them. Again, you should be voting now if you have not voted yet. All right, we have a bag here, and it does have, we're trying to, there's reason, but we have our position, but we're trying to take both sides. So we have our Dare to Keep Kids Off of Drugs shirt. All right, great, if that's your thing. We also have, oh my goodness, this looks like an evidence bag. I am promised, this is absolutely not full of drugs. Absolutely not full of drugs. What is this? That definitely looks like drugs in yet another evidence. There's so many evidence bags, all full of drugs. And my favorite, my favorite here. Yeah. We're gonna find out if Charles is gonna get these here. So I don't even know how we got these because as my recollection was that they were illegal, but we have candy cigarettes, and I'm told they're the good kind. I don't know what that means, but whoever bought these for us was like, oh, maybe they're not candy. I don't know, folks. In any case, if you have not voted the second time, you now have about 10 seconds, and then we're going to close the voting a second time. Please finish your second vote right now. Okay, we are closing the vote. All right, are we ready? Are we ready? With our results, I think that's a thumbs up in the back, which means we are going to see the results of the first vote first. So let's see what the very first vote was. We had, let's see, 38% for legalization, 43% against legalization, and 19% undecided. All right, so remember the winner here is not the person who ends up, or not this team that ends up with the most votes, but the team that has moved the most votes towards their side. So let's see the winning results now. Okay, so legalization plus 13%. That means that Reason, Billy Binion, Jacob Sullum have won this debate. All right, folks, they get the prizes. Definitely not drugs. Here you go.
Charles, you can have my drug.
Thank you all so much. We now have an after party. It is at Right Proper Brewery, which does sell alcohol. It is right next door. If you go out, it is to your left. That's just go right out the door, and it is the first building to your left. You can get a beer or a club soda, whatever it is you like here. I just want to thank our sponsors here, the Arthur and Roop Foundation, the Foundation for Responsible Television, the estate of William K. Gordon III, and also thank you so much for coming and making this a great debate. Have a great night, everyone.